The most dangerous stories aren't the ones that explode into the open. They're the ones that arrive quietly, wrapped in respectability, buffered by money, influence, and a public image so polished that no one thinks to question it. This one began that way, not with sirens screaming down a boulevard, not with a press conference, not even with a headline that immediately made sense. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began with a phone call that didn't sound urgent enough for what it was about. A call placed from one of the most expensive zip codes in Los Angeles. A call that, according to early logs, took longer than it should have to escalate. A call that forced first responders to pause at a gate that usually opened without hesitation. Inside that gate sat a property everyone thought they understood. A $13.5 million estate in Brentwood. High hedges. Controlled access. A place designed to keep chaos out. A place belonging to Richard Hale, a legendary director whose work shaped generations, whose public persona was built on intelligence, warmth, and moral clarity, and his wife, Elaine Hale, a philanthropist whose name rarely appeared in headlines unless it was attached to a donation or a gala. They were supposed to be untouchable, and yet, on a quiet Sunday night, both were found dead inside their own home. That much became public quickly. Too quickly, some would argue. What didn't become public, not at first, was how strange the initial moments were, how uncertain the timeline seemed, how many decisions were made before all the facts were in, how fast the narrative locked into place. By the time most people heard about the case, the story already sounded finished. A son arrested. Charges filed. A clean explanation that allowed the public to grieve without asking too many uncomfortable questions. But stories that arrive pre-packaged often deserve a second look. Because this one, when you slow it down, when you resist the urge to rush to the ending, starts to feel wrong in subtle ways. Not explosive wrong, not obviously fabricated, just misaligned, as if pieces were forced together because they needed to be, not because they fit. The contradiction shows up almost immediately. Richard Hale spent his career dissecting power, corruption, and the danger of moral shortcuts. His films warned against believing official versions too easily, against trusting institutions that moved too fast and asked too few questions. And yet, in Death, his own story was handled with remarkable efficiency. Too remarkable. Within hours of the bodies being discovered, police attention centered on one person. The younger son, Evan Hale, who lived in the guest house behind the main estate. He was arrested that same night. 2 counts of first-degree murder. No public hesitation. No visible internal debate. Case closed. Or at least, that's how it was presented. But here's where the discomfort creeps in. Because families like the Hales don't operate in a vacuum. They are layered. Complicated. Burdened by expectations that never make it into police reports. And if you've covered enough high-profile cases, really covered them, you learn that what looks like clarity is often just pressure wearing a badge. Pressure to calm the public. Pressure to reassure investors, studios, donors. Pressure to show control. And sometimes, pressure to choose a version of events that feels manageable. So let's slow this down. Let's rewind to before the arrests, before the headlines, before a single narrative took hold. The Hale estate wasn't just a home. It was a system, a carefully managed ecosystem with multiple structures, separate living spaces, staff schedules, security routines that shifted depending on who was in town and who wasn't. Richard and Elaine lived in the main house. Evan, 32, lived in the guest house. Close enough to be family, far enough to be separate. And then there was the eldest son, Daniel Hale. His name barely appeared in the early coverage. When it did, it was mentioned in passing. Estranged. Lived out of state. Not present. Not relevant. That assumption, that distance equals disconnection, would shape everything that followed. But distance can be misleading, especially in families where emotional proximity doesn't always match geography. The first official report said the bodies were discovered by the couple's daughter, Lily Hale, 27, when she arrived at the house that evening. What the report didn't emphasize, but what would later surface through internal notes, was the language she used when speaking to police. She didn't just describe what she saw. She warned them. She told officers there was someone in the family who was dangerous, someone who should be a suspect. That phrase matters, because it suggests forethought, fear that existed before that night. A history that didn't begin with blood on the floor. So why wasn't that warning front and center? Why did the focus narrow so quickly? And why did the investigation move with such certainty before all family members were accounted for? These are not accusations, not conclusions. They are questions. And in investigative work, questions are often more revealing than answers, especially when the answers arrive too easily. There's another detail that doesn't sit comfortably once you notice it. The timing. Neighbors reported unusual activity earlier that evening. Not loud, not violent, just movement. Cars arriving and leaving at times that didn't match the family's typical patterns. Security footage from nearby properties would later confirm this, though only fragments were released publicly. Why fragments? Why not the full timeline? Officials cited privacy concerns, an ongoing investigation, the need to protect the integrity of the case. All reasonable explanations, until you remember how fast they declared the case solved. When investigations are truly ongoing, restraint usually follows. When they're rushing toward closure, information gets selective. That selectivity shapes perception, and perception shapes pressure. The public was told Evan had a troubled past, that he struggled, that he lived on the property but remained isolated, that he was volatile. Some of that may be true, but the way it was framed made one thing clear. This was meant to feel inevitable, as if the outcome had been waiting to happen, as if no other explanation deserved oxygen. But inevitability is often a narrative choice. Here's the part that many people miss. When police arrested Evan, they didn't say they had solved everything. They said they had enough. Enough to charge. Enough to move forward. Enough to satisfy the immediate demand for resolution. Enough is not the same as certainty. And in cases like this, enough can be dangerous. Because once a suspect is in custody, the investigation doesn't just continue. It narrows. Evidence is interpreted through a lens that assumes guilt. Alternative theories become distractions instead of possibilities. That's when blind spots form. And blind spots are where the truth hides. There were early signs of those blind spots here. Witness statements that didn't align perfectly. Forensic timelines that had margins of error wider than what was publicly acknowledged. Phone records that placed certain individuals closer to the property than initially reported. Those details didn't disappear. They just didn't lead the story. Instead, the narrative leaned on something simpler. A family tragedy, a disturbed son, a sudden eruption of violence inside a controlled environment. It made sense, which is exactly why it worked. But sense isn't the same as truth. And when you examine the Hale family dynamic more closely, sense starts to fracture. Richard Hale was not a passive patriarch. He was controlling in ways that never appeared cruel on the surface, but carried weight over decades. Elaine managed the emotional labor of the family, smoothing conflicts, absorbing tensions, keeping the public image intact. Their children grew up inside privilege and scrutiny, love and expectation, freedom and surveillance. That combination produces very specific fractures. Some children rebel outwardly. Others go quiet. Others disappear just far enough to be labeled estranged, while still remaining deeply entangled. Daniel Hale fit that last category. The eldest son, the one who left early, the one whose absence was interpreted as irrelevance. But absence can also be strategic, and sometimes it's temporary. Here's something else worth sitting with. When Lily warned police about a dangerous family member, she didn't specify who, at least not in the portions of the report that were released. Investigators interpreted her concern through their existing focus. Interpretation is powerful. It can turn ambiguity into confirmation. And confirmation bias is the quiet engine behind many miscarriages of justice. So ask yourself this. If you were a detective standing inside that house, surrounded by evidence, pressure, media interest, and a grieving family, how much room would you really have to question the most convenient conclusion? How much space would there be for doubt? Because doubt is expensive in cases like this. It costs time. It costs political capital. It costs trust. And sometimes, it costs reputations. That's why this story matters now. Not because it's sensational. Not because it involves wealth or fame. But because it exposes the tension between truth and closure. Between investigation and narrative. Between what happened and what we're willing to believe happened. In the days after the arrests, legal analysts praised the speed of the response. Commentators spoke about accountability. About consequences. About justice moving swiftly. Very few asked whether justice was moving carefully. Very few asked who benefited from the story being over. And almost no one asked what hadn't been examined yet. That silence is not accidental. It's structural. It's the product of systems designed to stabilize chaos quickly, even if stabilization requires simplification. But simplification has a cost. It erases nuance. It sidelines inconvenient facts. It leaves unresolved questions buried beneath certainty. And unresolved questions have a way of resurfacing, especially when families start to fracture under the weight of official truth, especially when evidence doesn't stay quiet, especially when someone who was supposed to be peripheral begins to reappear in places they shouldn't be. Because as this case moved forward, quietly, behind closed doors, something shifted. A name that hadn't mattered began to matter. A timeline that felt settled began to loosen. And investigators were forced to confront a possibility they hadn't planned for. That the story they thought they were telling wasn't complete. And that the person they thought was distant might have been closer than anyone realized. But what happened next didn't unfold in public. Not immediately. It happened in files, in call logs, in internal conversations that never made it into press releases. And when those details began to surface, they didn't just complicate the case. They threatened to reopen it. Because the moment you consider the possibility of an accomplice or a misdirection, everything changes. Motives shift, timelines bend, and guilt becomes a question instead of an answer. And the first crack in the official story appeared not at the crime scene. The quiet cracks grew louder once you started connecting dots no one wanted to connect. Staff schedules that seemed mundane suddenly carried weight. Security logs that were overlooked now looked suspicious. Minor discrepancies, a gate left unlocked for 5 extra minutes, a delivery logged at an unusual hour, became pieces of a puzzle that no one outside the inner circle could see. And then there were the small behavioral details, the ones that often go unreported but linger in memory. A neighbor noticed that Evan, the younger son, had been walking the property late that evening, though he was supposed to be in the guest house. Nothing overt, nothing obviously threatening, but enough to make someone who knew him pause. Enough to make them wonder about patterns they hadn't noticed before. Meanwhile, Daniel, the eldest, remained off the radar. Publicly, he was estranged, a term so neat it almost felt like it had been invented to absolve the family of scrutiny. Privately, he was not as distant as the headlines suggested. Calls logged, social media interactions, subtle financial transactions, small, almost invisible threads tied him to the estate and the family in ways that, at first glance, no one thought mattered. This is the tension at the heart of the story. Distance that isn't really distance, absence that isn't absence, guilt that might not belong to the person everyone assumed. It's the sort of contradiction that investigators, journalists, and even casual observers of high-profile families come across more often than we admit. And it's the one that forces you to slow down, step back, and question the version of events being handed to you. It's worth noting here the emotional stakes, too. Families like the Hales don't just collapse under the weight of a single event. They fracture slowly, quietly, over decades of expectation, obligation, and unspoken rules. The veneer of wealth and stability masks fault lines, small fissures that grow into cracks under stress. And when tragedy strikes, those cracks are suddenly illuminated. Everyone who thought they understood the family's dynamics realizes they understood very little at all. Think about that. The difference between perception and reality. The public sees a story that looks resolved. Arrest made. Charges filed. Headlines written. The private world tells a very different story. One of fear, anticipation, and premonition that something was wrong long before the official narrative began. It's a dichotomy that makes cases like this so compelling and so dangerous to report. Because in reporting it, you have to navigate both realities. You have to respect grief. You have to respect facts. And you have to resist the gravitational pull of convenience, the pull that says, this story is tidy. Let's leave it at that. There's also a psychological layer here that cannot be ignored. The way people process trauma, the way children perceive parents, the way siblings interpret each other, all of these factors matter. And in the Hales case, that layer is particularly complex. Not just because of wealth or fame, but because the family's internal communication patterns were themselves a form of control. Subtle, invisible, but deeply influential. A word said or withheld could shift the entire family dynamic. A warning ignored could have devastating consequences. Which brings us back to Lily, the daughter who discovered the bodies. She didn't just report what she saw, she reported what she feared. And fear, in a house with history, has its own logic. Her statement, about a dangerous family member, might have been the first inkling that the narrative being shaped publicly was incomplete. Yet the public narrative didn't catch it. Early reporting reduced it to a throwaway line, a minor note in the unfolding tragedy. But the investigators who were paying attention, those who sift through the layers instead of just glancing at the surface, understood its significance immediately.